Part 22. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 217. Some people like to seek death. Now it is obvious that Subai belongs to the latter. The woman's body is left here. He did not chase the mind controller who seemed more troublesome, but chased the man with the arrow. The two of them were divided into two. Subai could only chase one of those running away in different directions. The mind controller is obviously more difficult to deal with, and Subai's enhanced attributes don't have much advantage over the mind controller. On the contrary, the archer, Subai feels more confident. However, while chasing, Subai sent Chu Zhao a location. There should be some good things in this woman or in her red car. In fact, Subai took action against them and wanted to kill them, not out of a noble idea of cleaning up the debris for the audience. Subai also it's not that leisurely, and if we look at it from the perspective of morality and law in the real world, all the audience members would gather together and shoot each other with their eyes closed, only those who were missed and not killed by mistake would be killed. Find a good person from the audience and follow him. It's as incredible as finding a white lotus in a manure pit. An upright reason, an upright opportunity. To kill the audience. To seize their things. How could Subai be willing to give up? Moreover, it has been a while since the last story world ended. People. Gotta get some exercise. The opponent was very fast. Even though he was carrying a bow and arrow on his back, he still ran like an ape. His feet were bare and the soles of his feet were close to the ground. He was steady and there was no need to worry about his balance while running fast. Subai let out a low roar in his throat. The damage radius of the Hellfire shotgun was limited. From such a distance, Subai could only hit the air, so the first thing he had to do was to catch up. After switching to vampire state, Subai's speed suddenly increased to a new level. The sensitivity of the vampires came in handy at this time. The other party turned around and saw Subai who was still chasing him. He seemed to be cursing something, but he still didn't dare to shoot at Subai, because at this time, Subai had a reasonable angle to kill him and chase him. He couldn't attack Subai, otherwise he would be tainted with the causal relationship. This was actually equivalent to shooting himself in the foot. Unless he was willing to risk the next crisis that would suddenly increase the difficulty of the story world, he would not dare to take the initiative to fight Subai. Obviously, he hasn't made up his mind yet. He is still hesitating. He is still taking chances. He thinks that he can get rid of Subai and change places. After a while, even if he meets Subai again in the future, at that time, Subai didn't have much reason to take action against him, because after a long time, Subai was not deceived by this scam. Subai had no loss, and it was not a deep hatred. The rules of horror broadcasting are sometimes so humane and worth savoring. Buzz. Subai saw that the person he was chasing actually climbed over the railing and jumped down. It was like jumping from several stories high, and there was still a lot of traffic below. Suddenly speeding up again, Subai also jumped down like him, but when Subai was falling, he grabbed the pillar with one hand to slow down his momentum. When he landed, Subai's palms were already bloody. But he didn't care and continued to chase. The distance between the two sides is now about 30 meters. Two men chased each other on the main road, even going against the grain. Damn it! Subai heard the man in front shout. Immediately afterwards, the opponent turned his head, opened his bow and drew an arrow. Can't bear it anymore? A smile appeared on Subai's lips, and then he began to walk in the S-line. However, the opponent's mouth seemed to be reciting some spell, and then a blue light appeared on his bow and arrow, and he shot out. Subai was stunned. The opponent's arrow was not aimed at him, but hit the ground 2 meters in front of him. Missed the shot. The next moment, the arrow hitting the ground suddenly burst into 10 blue rays of light. Catapult. Sputter. Subai's face turned cold, and 2 blue rays of light directly pierced his body. Fortunately, one was on his arm and the other was on his lower abdomen. Sudbai's reaction in that instant was just to let his body, he was still in position to avoid it, but it was obviously impossible to completely avoid it. Several surrounding vehicles were also hit by bullets. Some car bodies were punctured, some tires were punctured, and several thumb-thick pits appeared on the ground. The traffic was temporarily in chaos. If this arrow is used in a team battle, the effect is really very good. The killing radius is large, and it is difficult for the enemy to guard against it. Roar! A flash of red began to appear in Sudbai's eyes, and he started running again. The wounds on his body were healing at a speed visible to the naked eye. The man in front seemed to be surprised by this. Because of that arrow, he consumed a lot of energy, so his running speed was no longer as fast as before, while Sudbai behind him was slowly running. The ground closed the distance. The opponent jumped directly over the flower bed and entered the auxiliary road. Sudbai followed closely behind. When Sudbai just jumped over, the opponent was already waiting for him. Instead of running away, he turned around and swept directly at Sudbai with his bow and arrow. Sudbai lifted the Hellfire shotgun in his hand and had no time to shoot, but it directly clamped the opponent's long bow like a blunt instrument. The opponent kicked it out, and Sudbai kicked it out at the same time. The two of them in an instant, there was a muffled sound at the feet, and the two of them flew out together and landed heavily on the ground. On Sudbai's side, a truck happened to be rushing over. Sudbai had to stop and stand across the truck, waiting for the truck to drive over his head before getting up again, but there was no trace of the truck. Whirring. Sun Zhang was walking on the side of the small road, breathing heavily. The bow and arrow were still on his body, but the weight was much heavier than before. This was because his body was much more tired than before. Damn, bastard. Sun Zhang kept cursing. Sun Zhang knew that he was still tainted with some karma. Even if he did not kill Sudbai, but he injured Sudbai, the difficulty of his next story world would definitely be increased, which also meant that he would not be able to kill Sudbai. The probability of a story world surviving has been reduced a lot. This made Sun Zhang feel very uncomfortable. If he hadn't been deceived, he hadn't been deceived. In fact, the three of them had tried many scams against the audience based on the list they found out from a big shot's house, and not every time they were successful. There were successes and there were failures, but the listeners who saw through it really didn't have the kind of people like Sudbai who shot and killed people without any room for negotiation. And don't fight to the death. The listeners pay attention to a kind of compromise of interests, rather than the two extremes of life and death. This is also the unique culture of the listener circle, but Sun Zhang knows that the man named Sudbai seems to be completely different from this circle. The ground is out of place. In fact, this is indeed the case, otherwise, the original monk would not have made Sudbai disgraced. At this moment, a roar of an engine came from behind him. Like a frightened mouse, Sun Zhang immediately turned his head and saw a taxi driving towards here at high speed. This was a country road. It's just wide enough for two cars to pass each other, and there are houses around. You have to be crazy to drive at such a fast speed here, but Sun Zhang's eyesight is very good. He immediately captured the scene in the cab, and he was driving the taxi. The driver of the car was Sudbai. Damn it, he's at it again. The anger that Sun Zhang had long suppressed in his heart could no longer be suppressed. He had been chased by Sudbai so many times, so far away, but the other party still didn't give up and continued to catch up. This was really forcing him to fight to the death. A kind of crazy idea is constantly growing in Sun Zhang's heart. Even if the next round of the story world will be more difficult, it doesn't matter. I will kill you first. This is also because Sudbai has forced Sun Zhang to drive him crazy. Sun Zhang opened his bow and drew an arrow. He did not dodge or fear, and his anger was already burning. The next moment, his blood began to overflow from his palm, and then merged into the longbow, and the longbow began to release a faint blood color. Brilliance! Immediately afterwards, Sun Zhang's whole body tensed up, and he chanted obscure spells in his mouth. Walking gold digs opened a yaku crack. An arrow shot out. A bloody dragon shadow then appeared, rushing directly towards the road with an indomitable momentum, and met the taxi. Oh 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 oh. Subai, who had stepped on the accelerator and finally caught up again, suddenly saw the shadow of a giant dragon rushing towards him, and couldn't help but let out a low roar, but at this time he wanted to change direction or brake. It was too late to get down. Fortunately, Subai didn't wear a seat belt, because he had snatched the car by himself. After seeing that the road in front of him had been dug up by the ghost of the dragon, Subai simply the ground directly opened the car door and jumped out, but was still swept away by the aftermath. The whole person was overturned and fell heavily to the ground. After releasing this move, Sun Zhang also knelt down. His face was pale, and he even seemed to have no strength to breathe. At this time, he was really too weak. At the other end, Subai was lying in a bloody field on the side of the road, with pain all over his body. However, Subai still put his hand into his arms tremblingly. Then, he took out the mask from his arms. Subai was lying in the field with his face sideways, just in time for him to slowly move the mask over, and then turned his head slightly. Mask. Face. Finally stuck together. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 218. The moment the mask stuck to his face, Subai felt that he had forgotten all the pain on his body, and his whole person suddenly became extremely calm. It seemed that the frequency of every breath he took was perfectly captured by him. Arrive. He slowly stood up. This body, to him now, felt more like a restraint on his soul. At this time, he even wanted to peel off his own skin and cut his own flesh and blood. Break your own bones and free yourself. This is something that is difficult to describe in words, because after putting on the mask, what rose up in Subai's heart was not contempt for the things around him, but contempt for himself. Always felt. It would not be a pity to lose this body, but it would be better to destroy it. It was this emotion that invisibly separated Subai's consciousness from this body. He no longer felt his pain or joy. Only left with kill. When Subai walked, he limped, but walked very firmly. Blood kept flowing on his body, and his skin was constantly changing. This was because the vampire blood was repairing Subai's body, but maybe it was because the injury was too severe. The reason is heavy, so it is very slow. Of course, the most important reason should be that I need blood, fresh blood. With raw materials, some blood. Vampire bloodline can truly bring out its own characteristics. Sun Zhang was completely out of strength at this time. He tried his best to lift the longbow again, but he kept failing. His left arm was even broken. It was not because he had strength but because he couldn't lift the longbow even if he had strength. His arms pulled the longbow out of the arc again. Subai kept approaching, maintaining a constant speed. Although he was limping, it brought even greater pressure. Maybe this has something to do with personality. There is a kind of person who is not afraid to enter the story world, which is similar to Subai. If he is not summoned by the horror broadcast for a long time to enter the story world to relax his muscles and bones, he will panic and feel unbearably itchy. Therefore, finally meeting an audience member that he can kill in the real world is just like a pervert who has a certain level of lust for women and suddenly sees a beautiful woman stripping off her clothes and standing dancing in front of him. No room for negotiation. Sun Zhang said weakly. This didn't even kill Subai. Sun Zhang had given up completely. In fact, Sun Zhang didn't complain much in his heart. He just felt very aggrieved. Yes, very aggrieved. If it weren't for the damn rules of horror broadcasting, in the real world of the story, how could the man in front of him beat the three of him like this? In other words, if the three of them had shown an aura that they would rather live in pieces than in ruins from the beginning, and showed a determination to advance and retreat together even if they completely violated the rules of terrorist broadcasting, maybe the person in front of them would be he won't be so arrogant anymore. Zhao Yan will not die, and she will not be reduced to this situation. Subai staggered over. Facing Sun Zhang's words, Subai just shook his head slightly, and then nodded again. A glimmer of hope suddenly appeared in Sun Zhang's eyes. Most people still have a great fear of death. However, at this time, Sun Zhang seemed to have forgotten how Subai killed Zhao Yan before. Perhaps. For a mentally ill person like Subai, killing is indeed a kind of pleasure, so much so that an art has been derived. How to kill can maximize this pleasure. For example, eating itself is a kind of pleasure, and delicious food, with all its color, aroma, and taste, magnifies the pleasure of food to a greater extent. Subai, who puts on the mask, has become a machine controlled by his own negative emotions. Of course, this is what Subai likes. There's something I want to talk to you about. Subai said, his voice a little weak and a little tired. In fact, Subai was also seriously injured, but he was better than Sun Zhang. Moreover, Subai could still shoot. Sometimes, it is indeed more convenient to simply pull the trigger than to draw an arrow. This was illustrated by the charge of the Senglinkan cavalry against the gun array of the British and French forces during the Qing dynasty. You say, Sun Zhang pursed his chapped lips, looking very eager. He could talk, speak, and bargain. It was no problem. He even gave Subai the remaining story points to exchange for something. There is no problem at all. As long as you are still alive, as long as you can continue to live, this is the foundation, this is the must, this is the final bottom line, the bottom line is still there, everything can be discussed. What did you shout when you shot that arrow just now? Subai asked. What? Sun Zhang was confused. He didn't know why Subai was asking this. Do you know Japanese? Sun Zhang shook his head and said with a wry smile, I just felt that those words sounded good when I shouted them to suit my skills, so I kept shouting them with these words. Oh, then you shouted wrong. What you just shouted probably meant to strike me with a sword. It was a sword from a long sword, not an arrow from an archery. As soon as he finished speaking, Subai had already raised the muzzle of the gun and pointed it at Sun Zhang's chest. Sun Zhang was almost petrified, and with his last mosquito-like voice, full of disbelief, he asked. You just want to talk about this? Yes, Subai nodded seriously. Then. Boom. Gunshots were fired. Every society has its own class. Human society or group society is composed of one class after another. In those fiery red years, there were many ancestors with lofty dreams who wanted to break this class system. Establish a free society where everyone is equal, but decades of reality have completely shattered this illusion, or in other words, the dream has always been so plump, but the reality has always been so skinny. For example, the hospital where Subai lives now is not open to the public and only accepts special patients. Those who can be treated here are people with extraordinary status. Subai's assets are being handed over and transferred. Subai did not say that he would donate his share to the Hope Project, because in Subai's view, donating money to those so-called institutions is a greater sin. Bai's idea is actually very simple. Divide his equity and assets in his name if they can, and transfer them if they can, so as not to affect the continued operation of the group originally established by his parents. It was Suner who used his connections to arrange for Subai to be admitted to this hospital. At this time, it was early in the morning, and Suner was sitting beside Subai's hospital bed, peeling apples for Subai, while Chu Zhao was sitting on a chair, a little listless. After a while, Subai stretched slightly. The injuries on his body were actually not bad. He could just nurse him for a while. Moreover, during this period, the hospital would continue to give Subai blood transfusions at Sunur's request. Fresh blood is injected into the body every day, and it is difficult for Subai not to recover early. Moreover, because of the special nature of this hospital, there are no restrictions on some medical procedures like those in other hospitals. "Have you got everything?" Subai asked. Sunur brought the peeled apple slices to Subai's mouth. Subai smiled and shook his head, indicating that he didn't want to eat it. At this time, Chuzeale became more energetic. He took out a bag next to him and placed it on Subai's hospital bed. At the same time, he took out the contents one by one. A purple awl, a longbow, some arrows, and other bits and pieces. The purple awl should belong to Zhao Yuan, and the longbow should naturally belong to Sun Zhang. "You guys should split up," Subai said. Sunur was a little surprised and said, "How embarrassing is this?" Chu Zhao also shook his head. "How can we have the nerve to just take the loot you worked so hard to get? Just think of it as something you owe me," Subai said nonchalantly. In fact, he didn't value these things very much. What he valued more was the sensory experience when chasing and killing those people. To put it more artistically, Subai valued this process more. Instead of this result. Of course, there is another very important reason. Subai called Chu Zhao and Sunur or shared their location, asking them to be responsible for cleaning up the battlefield. Since they were involved, based on their relationship with Subai, if they return empty-handed, the relationship between the three of them will be completely broken. After all, Chu Zhao and Sunur are still just experiencers. It is when they need magic weapons and weapons the most, and they also have the most urgent desire. When strength protects oneself. Subai knew clearly that he, Chu Zhao, and Sunur were a little different from him and Fatty Monk. There was affection between the three of them. Sometimes affection was worthless, but sometimes affection was worthless. Very valuable. Sunur and Chu Zhao looked at each other. Sunur put away the purple awl, and Chu Zhao put away the longbow. Neither of them said thank you, because saying thank you at this time was a bit too perfunctory. "I usually practice more, even if it's an experience mission. It's not impossible to get story points," Subai reminded, and then he shrank into the bed. "I'm tired." Sunur and Chu Zhao understood and both left the ward, but they did not leave, but stayed in the nursing room next door. Subai closed his eyes and felt that the situation in his body had basically stabilized. Then he reached out and took out a small bottle from the drawer of the bedside table. He twisted the small bottle open and aimed the bottle mouth at the center of his eyebrows. The nails first scratched the center of his eyebrows, leaving a trail of blood. Then, the drop of blood in the small bottle also dripped down. It just happened to be where the wound was. Bring it on. Evolution. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 219. When this drop of blood entered from the wound Subai had just scratched and merged with Subai's blood, a breath of spirit and blood released from the blood began to emanate, just like a drop of ink dropped into the clear water. Middle. Subai's bloodline is almost equivalent to a glass of water for this drop of blood essence, which means that Subai's own bloodline is basically incomparable with this drop of blood essence. The bloodline level of the owner of this drop of blood essence is much higher than Subai expected. Maybe, Fatty never expected this. Subai suddenly wanted to ask Fatty about the origin of this drop of blood. Did he get it from the story world? What I got was obtained in the real world. If it was obtained in the real world, it proves that I can still find some clues and dig out more. In the haze, Subai's entire consciousness merged into this drop of blood. As if in a dream, Subai suddenly realized that he was not lying on a hospital bed, but was nailed to a cross, surrounded by dazzling eyes. The sun and a group of knights wearing bright armor. The sun seemed so annoying at this time. Subai could even feel that his skin was constantly twisting and folding under the sun. However, this was a dynamic balance. The sun was like a raging fire to him now. The ground is roasting his body, but his body is still instinctively undergoing a kind of self-recovery. In other words, it can be said that this is a kind of dynamic torture, continuous suffering. Where is this place? It should be the memory image in this drop of blood. Essence and blood can condense many, many things. According to rumors, a truly terrifying vampire, even if his whole body collapses, as long as there is a drop of essence and blood retained, he can recondensate his body from this drop of essence and blood. This in the drops of essence and blood, there is this memory scene. The unbearable scorching sun, the knights with stern faces around them who smelled disgusting to Subai, the dirty cross, everything was so bad. Soon, two cardinals walked slowly step by step. They walked very slowly, which made Subai's anger and heat even more intense. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. What came out was a cry. A howl similar to that of a wild beast. His vocal cords have been damaged and his entire body is in tatters. It is no small miracle that he can continue to live with such a body. The cardinal held something similar to an edict in his hand and began to read. Subai couldn't understand what they were saying. It was not English, but it should be some language on earth. After reading the long and sour edict, the two cardinals stood on either side of Subai, then knelt down and began to pray. Hundreds of knights on the field also drew their swords and pierced the ground. Then they held the hilt of the sword with one hand and knelt down on one knee. They kept chanting something, which still made Subai feel upset. Chaos, feeling restless. Now Subai felt that he was like a handful of hay. Some people were constantly moving him closer to the stove, while others were constantly adding gasoline to the hay. In short, everyone, everything around him made Subai feel like he was going to explode. Yes, in fact, Subai did explode. A ball of fire descended from the sky and landed directly on the cross where Subai was. The two cardinals burned together in the fire, but they continued to recite something motionless. Subai's body began to melt under the fire. The body is constantly melting and evaporating, and the immortal self seems to be getting closer and closer to death, and the breath of death is constantly pressing in. In the end, Subai let out his last howl, and everything turned into nothingness. The cross and the two cardinals were burned to ashes. However, among the ashes, there is also a drop of blood that remains unknown. Whirring. When Subai woke up from the memory of that drop of blood, he found that his sweat had soaked the sheets and bedding. The wound on his forehead that he had made to catch the drop of blood had healed at this time, but the feeling of anxiety and anger seemed to have not completely faded away. The skull mask seemed to be inspired by Subai's heart and took the initiative to remove it. The drawer floated out and appeared at Subai's bedside. This mask seemed to be a sign of goodwill to Subai, signaling Subai to put it on quickly. Roll. An angry shout came from Subai's throat, and the light on the mask disappeared in an instant and fell to the ground. This mask is spiritual, and Subai will never allow himself to be affected or controlled by the magic weapon in his hand, not even the slightest hint of it. Dong dong dong. There was a knock on the ward door. It was already late at night. Subai, what's wrong? Sunar actually hasn't gone back yet, but has been staying in the nursing room next door. I want to take a bath, Subai said. Good. Sunar opened the door and walked in, only to see Subai lift the quilt and get out of the hospital bed. Is everything really healed? You can also exchange it for one, just wait until you have accumulated enough story points, Subai said. My path is a little more difficult than that of ordinary listeners, so it should be smoother for you. Yes, Not being able to rely on story points to upgrade and strengthen through WeChat stores does make Sudbai's path much more difficult than other listeners. No, I have already thought about what I want to exchange. Suner smiled slightly, then took the initiative to help Sudbai prepare clothes and other toiletries, and then asked, "Do you want my help?" "Help me take a bath?" Sudbai asked. "You are a patient," Suner said. "Forget it, my body has just recovered and I need to recharge my batteries." Dasim Suner spat at Sudbai, "Since you're almost done now, I'll go back first. I have something to do at home. I'll bring you breakfast tomorrow morning." Okay, Sudbai nodded, then took off his patient clothes and walked into the bathroom. The cold water poured down, making Sudbai shiver and feel very comfortable. After taking a shower and shaving his beard, Sudbai felt much refreshed. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at himself in the mirror. To be honest, Sudbai was very curious about what was happening on his body. Change. The drop of blood has been integrated into his body, but there doesn't seem to be any specific changes. A good way to test a vampire's bloodline is, on the one hand, blood magic, and on the other, the recovery efficiency of the body after being injured. Unfortunately, for Sudbai, he still has not found a way to use blood magic. There is no way to directly obtain the first blood magic enhancement from the Wadian. Everything is equivalent to starting from scratch. This is really too difficult for Sudbai. Well, you must first sense the magical aura of the vampires, and then understand it step by step. For example, what Fatih redeems is the physique of a Taoist priest. Some Taoist methods can be understood by oneself, but they must have the most basic level and foundation. These are all given directly by the horror broadcasting WeChat store, which is equivalent to opening a new one for you. Express, if Fatih needs decades of enlightenment before he can actually use the debut method, it is estimated that no audience will dare to choose the strengthening route of Taoist priests. The fast-paced frequency of the world of horror broadcast missions naturally does not allow Sudbai to slowly engage in blood magic research, but the other way to experiment is much simpler. The nails made a deep cut on the inside of his left arm, and blood flowed out. Then, scabs formed in an instant, and then fell down, leaving a scar. Then the scar gradually faded until it finally disappeared. The speed was twice as fast as before, and there was no feeling of weakness in his mind. The effect is still very obvious. Sudbai touched his disappeared wound, feeling a little disappointed. This drop of blood seemed to have indeed improved his bloodline level, but it only made it difficult for him to change from the original one. Killing has just become more difficult to kill. Although the degree has changed, there seems to be no real difference in essence. Sudbai shook his head, opened the bathroom door and was about to go out. His feet suddenly slipped. Sudbai subconsciously began to adjust his body's center of gravity. For ordinary people, it might be impossible to avoid falling, but for Sudbai, he said that his body's balance ability and reaction ability are indeed stronger, so he has no time to adjust. However, the next moment, Sudbai found himself standing outside the bathroom door. Half a meter distance. It came in an instant. Sudbai's whole body suddenly trembled, and his Adam's apple trembled. He turned around in disbelief and looked at his current position. He was definitely not hallucinating. He must have moved half a meter in just a moment. After returning to the bathroom, Sudbai stood in the bathroom, facing the outside, and then looking for the feeling just now. His whole body slowly fell forward, without deliberately controlling his center of gravity. The next moment, Sudbai was surprised to find that his whole body had entered a kind of blurred shadow, and began to float and sneak. He turned his head and saw his own image in the mirror, which was completely a black shadow and could not be seen. If a person's figure is in darkness or hidden under the shadow of sunlight, it will be difficult to detect it. You, sneaking in the shadows, like a god of death lurking in the shadows. When Sudbai subconsciously stood firm, the shadow dissipated and he reappeared from the shadow. It feels, not bad. Sudbai suddenly felt moved in his heart. Oh shit. I finally no longer have to exchange damage head-on with others every time I fight, and I finally have the ability to inflict damage on others and circumvent others. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao Long. Chapter 220. A long, long time ago, you owned me and I owned you. A long, long time ago, you left me and went to soar in the sky. The world outside is wonderful, but the world outside is helpless. The resident singer, who had hair similar to Chi-Chin's, sang emotionally there. Since it was afternoon, there were not many customers in the bar. While the fat man was drinking a cocktail, he gently tapped the table with his palms and beat to the tune of the music. Sudbai leaned his hands behind his back and lay lazily on the chair. After the song ended, Fatty opened his eyes with a touch of melancholy and sadness. He sings really well, Fatty praised. It's a pity that I am imitating outdated singers, Sudbai said. You don't understand art. The fat man gave Sudbai a middle finger to show his contempt for Sudbai's blasphemy of art. I understand life. Sudbai accepted the sentence, and then gently tapped his coffee cup with a spoon. Sudbai didn't drink a sip of this cup of coffee, even the coffee cup, sugar cubes, etc. authentic, but it cannot conceal the essence of a cup of instant coffee. Obviously, this bar is not as pure as imagined. I'm going in tomorrow. I feel like I haven't relaxed for long before I have to go in again. The fat man looked very sentimental. I don't know when it will be over. Sudbai continued to add sugar to his coffee, although he did not intend to drink it. What about you? Fatty asked when Sudbai didn't respond. I enjoy it, Sudbai replied. I also want to become mentally ill, so that I can have the subjective initiative to enter the world of the story, Fatty joked. You asked me out today just to talk about chicken soup for the soul to soothe your nervousness about entering the story world tomorrow. Sudbai tapped his spoon gently on the coffee cup, matching the rhythm of the New Clothes song. I don't know many people in Shanghai. Before entering the story world, I used to find someone to chat with and relax myself. The fat man smiled, but it seems like you don't like Cheng. I'm not that artistic, Sudbai said. But you look very artistic, with a handsome face, a cool temperament, and you can also play the piano. Gee, you are much more popular in places like this than me. Generally, places like Kingba are used to hook up with frustrated young women and young girls in Huaichan. Of holy places. Sudbai took a deep breath and stretched out his hand to signal the waiter to come over and pay. Sit a little longer, the fat man said, a little dissatisfied. He hadn't had enough fun yet. Then you take your time and play. Sudbai put the cash on the table, walked out of the bar, took out a cigarette, and held it in his mouth. The fat man followed him out. You are really frustrated, the fat man complained. Sudbai blew out a smoke ring and nodded. Are you going back to the hotel? Where are you going? The fat man asked. I'm going to see a friend. She was injured a while ago. I don't know how she is doing now. The audience. No, they are ordinary people. Where are you going to see? Prince Building. Okay, let's go together. Anyway, I'm going to use it today to adjust my mental state. Fatty seemed very indifferent. Every listener has his own way of relaxing and adjusting before entering the story world. For Sudbai, the best way to adjust is to watch TV and play with toys with the little one. Sudbai drove the car out. When the fat man on the side saw the car, he held his chin in surprise. Are you going to be so awesome? You really replaced the Lamborghini with a Busa. Get in the car. This car was given by a friend, otherwise I would have to ride a battery car out today. Sudbai waved to the fat man. The fat man got into the car. This obviously second-hand Busa made the fat man very uncomfortable. All cars are actually the same. Anyway, if you die, I will burn a paper car for you at most. When did you have this kind of ideological consciousness? The fat man muttered. You can contact the monk to shave your head. Sudbai didn't speak and just drove quietly. After a quarter of an hour, the car drove into the underground parking lot of the prince's building. It's so hot, the fat man got out of the car and started to fan himself with his hands. Does your friend run a company here? Almost, we have a studio. A studio? Does it make animation or games? Relieving stress, physical therapist Sudbai said deliberately vaguely. Damn, this is okay. Fatty happens to be entering the story world tomorrow and needs to relax. A meaningful smile appeared on Sudbai's lips, and then he nodded, okay, I'll pay for it for you. Tisk, 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 don't you have no money? You are still spending money so lavishly. What you don't bring with you in life is what you won't take with you in death, as long as it's enough. Tisk, 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 you are indeed a down and out rich man. His confidence in speaking in Pusa is different. Sudbai smiled, then walked into the elevator, and the fat man came in immediately. The elevator began to rise, and the fat man began to do preparatory exercises. What? Sudbai asked. If you want to get a massage, of course you have to loosen your muscles first. Well, I'm very experienced. Of course, he. When they reached the floor, Sudbai walked out and came to the door of Ying Ying's office. Sudbai saw an open sign hanging on the door. It seemed that Ying Ying had started working again. After walking in, Sudbai saw Ying Ying wearing a white dress and sitting behind the desk writing and drawing. Her skin color was a bit too white. It shouldn't be the effect of cosmetics, but her own weakness that led to lack of energy and blood. It used to be smooth, but it seems that Ying Ying's health is indeed not well yet. This woman is really working hard for her career. When Ying Ying saw someone coming, she looked up and immediately stood up enthusiastically, young Master Su, I'm glad to see you again. The fat man standing behind Sudbai also saw Ying Ying's appearance, and immediately showed a look like Brother Pig. Obviously, the fat man was very satisfied with Ying Ying's appearance, and thought if he could be treated like this before entering the story world, it would be a pleasant thing to have a massage to relax with this woman. It's a pity. The fat man felt a little regretful in his heart. The fool also knew that the way this woman looked at Sudbai was a little different, so he fancied the negative distance physical contact. It's impossible. If Sudbai knew what the fat man was thinking at this time, he would probably laugh out loud. The curtain in the office has not been opened yet, and the utensils are still hidden inside. To be honest, Sudbai had no intention of bringing the slut with him. The fat man came here, but this fat man wanted to come with him to experience it, so Sudbai was really looking forward to it. Your friend? Why don't you introduce me? Ying Ying looked at the fat man standing behind Sudbai and felt slightly happy. This etiquette is very classical, and it reveals a very special ladylike temperament in Ying Ying. Sudbai silently touched the tip of his nose, just call him Fatty, he's a nice guy. Fatty, this is Ying Ying professional. Professional, Fatty repeated, then smiled, and said, I like it. Can you still go to work now? Sudbai looked at Ying Ying don't force it. It's okay, I don't wear that kind of uniform, but I happen to have a kimono that suits me right now. Ying Ying smiled slyly. Sudbai understood, reached out and patted Ying Ying's shoulder, you're welcome. I'm a professional, Ying Ying responded. At this time, Sudbai's cell phone suddenly rang. It was the monk's call. I'll go outside to take a call. You can help my friend relax first. After saying that, Sudbai took the phone and walked out of the office, closing the office door. Walking to the window in the corridor, Sudbai pressed the answer button. Hey, Sudbai. The monk's voice was still so upright and peaceful. Sometimes Sudbai even thinks that the monk is very suitable to be a network anchor. He doesn't do anything else and just silently recites Amitabha in front of the camera. He is probably more popular than those women who expose their breasts. The anchor's popularity is many times higher. What's the matter, Subai asked, and at the same time, Subai was mentally prepared that the monk might ask about the painting. The poor monk will come to Shanghai tomorrow to attend a religious and cultural conference. He may want to bother you then. It's okay. I will be responsible for receiving you when you come to Shanghai. Well, that's it, Amitba. Amitba. Subai hung up the phone. Later, Subai walked to the office door and found that there was no movement inside. Subai was a little surprised and gently opened the office door and walked in. He did not believe that Ying was really giving a massage to the fat man. Sure enough, the fat man's hands were locked in shackles, and Ying had changed into a soft hanfu. There was a huge contrast between her clothes and the surrounding environment, giving people an even stronger sensory stimulation. She is truly a woman who looks like a fairy. There was a plastic bag on the fat man's head, and his body was shaking slightly. With Ying's professional level progress, the fat man seemed to be enjoying it a little bit. At this time, Subai's mobile phone suddenly pushed a news message. Subai clicked it and looked at it, then raised his head and said to the fat man who was enjoying himself in front of him, "Fat man, have you watched our 10 years? The fat man shook his head. "Chiao Ren Liang, do you know?" The fat man shook his head again. Obviously he was not interested in the entertainment industry. "A very good actor and singer committed suicide," Subai said sadly. There were rumors on the internet that he had bruises on his body and a plastic bag on his head when he died. These media are really unscrupulous. Even a deceased person is not spared, and he is arranged like this for the sake of news clicks. I have watched his movies and listened to his songs before. He was a pretty good young man. Alas, may the deceased rest in peace. These media reporters who spread rumors will definitely be punished. There is no bottom line at all. The fat man heard plastic bags, bruises, and death. His whole body trembled, and he immediately began to struggle desperately. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 221. The fat man was lying on the sofa, panting heavily and sweating profusely. Subai was sitting behind Ying's desk, with her feet on the table. Ying brought Subai some sake. After pouring it for Subai, she Shiren went down and changed into casual clothes and came out again. "Are you tired?" Subai asked. "I'm not tired, I enjoy it," Ying replied. Two perverts, Fatty muttered on the sofa. "Do you like the feeling of holding other people's lives in your own hands?" Subai asked. Ying nodded, "Because this can bring me a great sense of satisfaction. At the same time, controlling the string in people's hearts makes me feel very accomplished." Subai picked up the wine glass, toasted to Ying and drank it. To be honest, Subai didn't like sake very much. He still liked stronger liquor, but Subai didn't have the habit of drinking. It seemed that apart from cigarettes, he has no other bad habits. "What about you, are you tired lately?" "I'm fine." Subai waved his hand and said, "I've served you twice and I haven't paid you yet." "You can do it for free," Ying said. "I still have a few cars in the garage. I'll have someone drive one over to you tomorrow." Subai has been working as a money-splitting boy recently, and now there are several luxury cars in the garage that need to be dealt with. The Pusa he is driving now was given to Subai by Chu Zhao. "Do you want to keep me?" Ying sat directly on Subai's lap. Her body was soft and had a faint fragrance. The picture didn't look sexy, but it made people feel very comfortable. "I'm about to become a pauper, and I have a son. As for you, I can't afford to take care of him." "It's okay, I can take care of you." Ying lay on her side on Subai, and kept tapping Subai's chest with one skillful hand. "This sounds really touching." Subai gently patted Ying on the back. "It's getting late, I have to go back and cook for my son." Ying stood up from Subai knowingly and said coquettishly, "You know, Sometimes your ability to ruin the atmosphere is really annoying. Sorry. Sudbai bowed slightly, and then walked to the sofa. The fat man had already recovered, but with a smile on his face, he looked like he was really enjoying himself. Not dead. Nonsense, Fatty replied. Then let's go, you have to go in tomorrow, Sudbai reminded. I really feel like I just came out and escaped death. Suddenly, my whole world becomes clearer. Well, then you continue to stay here and have fun, I'll leave first. No, just take me back. Not going my way. Then I'll go to your house for a meal. By the way, don't tell me that you gave away your villa in Shanghai. Not yet, but it will be soon, Sudbai said. Well, let's go, I also want to have a taste of your craftsmanship. Sudbai and Fatty took the elevator directly to the underground parking lot, and drove out onto the highway. Fatty was looking for music nearby, but found that there was nothing else to listen to in the car except the radio, and he couldn't help but feel a little depressed. I said, in fact, you really don't need to be so decisive, even if you really want to be a perfect dad. I don't believe you can't afford to drive a luxury car or live in a luxury house if you want to, so don't tell me such nonsense here, Sudbai retorted unceremoniously. Yes, with the fat man's ability, it is definitely not a problem to make money and obtain a better life, but he doesn't. In fact, many listeners Sudbai knows also live a simple life. Yes, you are right, the fat man put one hand outside the car window, feeling the force and touch of the wind rushing through his palm, and suddenly asked, Abai, I forgot, okay, at what speed can you feel like squeezing a woman's breast when you put your hand outside? Sudbai had no intention of answering this very low-level question. However, the next moment, he suddenly felt a tightness and pain in his chest, and he suddenly stepped on the brakes and stopped the car to the right. The fat man's hand directly hit a restaurant sign on the side of the road, and he immediately took a breath of cold air. Just as he was about to curse, he saw Sudbai lying on the steering wheel in great pain. A mission notification came. Fatty looked at his somewhat red and swollen hands, and knew that this matter could not be pursued. The fat man himself had experienced how painful it was to receive a mission notification in the story world many times. After waiting for a while, Sudbai finally calmed down and took out his cell phone. Sure enough, the private message on the Kongbu 66 public WeChat ID came. There are still 3 days until we enter the mission world. 3 days. It's not the same story world as mine, Fatty said, a little disappointed. Do you really want me to kill you in the story world? Sudbai asked. Damn, you're so decisive. You cheated me last time and I haven't settled the score with you yet, Sudbai said. Anyway, if I have a chance to enter the story world with you next time, I won't do anything else but kill you first. Fatty. The notice was so brief this time, Sudbai coughed. I just told you the time, and didn't say anything else. Maybe telling you about the story world in advance will affect the fun of the story world, Fatty guessed. Let it go. Sudbai put the phone in the car drawer and started the car again. I'll take you back. I'm not in the mood to cook today. Yeah, Fatty said he understood. When Sudbai sent Fatty back to the hotel and drove back, he found that the little guy was playing with Jixiang in the flower garden in front of the villa. The little guy wanted to catch Jixiang's tail, but Jixiang almost let the little guy catch it on purpose every time. Then he immediately jumped out and had a great time with one person and one cat. Sudbai got out of the car and walked into the flower garden. The little guy happily crawled towards Sudbai for a hug. Picking up the little guy, Sudbai clearly felt that the little guy was indeed much heavier than before, or even much firmer. Your father won't be able to hold you if you get fatter. Sudbai stretched out his hand and gently rubbed the little guy's nose, and the little guy grabbed Sudbai's fingers with his small hands. Ji Xiang looked at Sudbai, and then jumped onto the table in the flower bed. There was an open picture scroll on the table. Ji Xiang tapped his paw on the picture scroll to signal Sudbai to come over. Sudbai came over with the little guy in his arms. At this time, the picture scroll showed a golden field and a festive scene of harvest. This picture would keep changing. Subai knew this, but Subai didn't know that the auspiciousness had always been there. What is the purpose of studying this? Could it be that this cat changed his career to become an archaeologist? Meow. Ji Xiang called out to the scroll. The call was long and seemed to have a special rhythm and accent. Immediately afterwards, in the picture, the golden waves of wheat began to disappear, a desolate scenery began to appear, and a simple altar made entirely of stone slowly appeared. Subai's eyes narrowed slightly. This scene was quite interesting. Jixiang jumped in front of Subai and waved his cat's paw in front of Subai. Subai opened his palm, and Jixiang used his cat's paw to scratch a hole in the palm of Subai's palm. Blood began to flow out slowly. Then Jixiang returned to the scroll and touched the scroll's altar with his paw. When the little guy saw that Subai was bleeding, he covered his eyes and did not dare to look. Subai coaxed the little guy gently, then walked to the scroll and put his palm on it. After a while, Subai moved his palm away and found that the altar turned blood red. Soon, the blood red began to slowly disappear. Finally, Subai's figure appeared on the altar in the scroll. Subai was sitting cross-legged on the altar with his eyes closed. This is another self? The next moment, Subai suddenly felt that his vision was confused. The scenery in front of him overlapped with the scenery in another direction, as if he suddenly had two completely different perspectives. Subai closed his eyes, then calmed down and opened his eyes again. Immediately afterwards, he saw a deserted area in front of him, with scattered bones everywhere, and he was standing on an altar. When I raised my head, I saw a grey sky. This scene is very desolate and monotonous. A piece of my consciousness has entered the scene of the scroll. So, what are the benefits of being here? This is what Subai wants to know the most. The monk is pursuing this thing. Many people are pursuing this thing. If this thing is just for people to read comic books, Subai does not believe that the monk and those powerful listeners will be so of boredom. This painting is definitely very attractive. Subai's eyes dropped slightly. He saw some very clear patterns on the altar at his feet. These patterns were very complex and mysterious. Subai had a hunch that this thing was related to his bloodline. Maybe it was a vampire. Magic. No one could understand Subai's desire for vampire magic. He immediately squatted down and began to observe these patterns with concentration, while constantly studying and comprehending them in his own mind. Time seems to have lost its meaning at this time. Here, Subai has forgotten time, hunger, cold, and warmth, and is completely immersed in it. Crash. Suddenly, it began to rain heavily in the sky. The heavy rain became more and more exaggerated. Finally, a terrifying water column crashed down and directly hit the altar where Subai was. Subai's whole body was knocked over. This period of consciousness it just disappeared. Buzz. Subai opened his eyes suddenly and found that it was already late at night. The little guy was standing on the table. He had just overturned a glass of water and wet the picture scroll. If the little guy hadn't splashed water on the scroll and wet it, Subai wouldn't have known how long he would have been obsessed with the scene just now. He raised his head suddenly and saw Ji Xiang standing on the second-floor balcony looking at him coldly. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 222. Subai looked at Ji Xiang, and Ji Xiang looked at Subai. One person and one cat looked at each other under the starry sky in the middle of the night. For a moment, there was a vague feeling of tension. Ji Xiang, the cat, actually doesn't have much contact with Subai. It stayed with Subai at first, just as a passive choice because of Li Ji's departure. In fact, before that, it could be with anyone. The reason why I followed Sudbai was just because it was more convenient to follow Sudbai at that time. They were not subordinates, masters, and servants, nor friends. They were just indifferent. Perhaps, without the little guy, Ji Xiang and Sudbai would have parted ways long ago. It was only because of the little guy that one person and one cat could continue to live together. Sudbai held the wet scroll in his hands. At this time, the scene in the scroll had undergone tremendous changes. It was no longer the deserted altar, but a sea of waves and heavy rain. Ji Xiang seemed to be a little tired. He knelt down and lay on the balcony, looking at the starry sky, exuding an aura of loneliness. Sudbai felt that Ji Xiang should have seen something and known something after looking at the scroll for so long, so he wanted to try it. In this family, Ji Xiang is not willing to let the little one lose even a drop of hair, so he can only look for Sudbai. However, this painting actually has a greater danger, that is, it is easy to be immersed in it and lose track of the years, just like visiting the countryside. It seems like a bad thing. If the little guy hadn't pushed down the glass of water, Sudbai might have stayed in the scroll until he was transported into the story world. If it were not less than 3 days before entering the story world, but a longer time, Sudbai's life might even be in danger. It is possible that only a trace of his soul would remain in the scroll, but his body would have decayed. The little guy sat on the table, looked at Sudbai, and then looked at the black cat. Sudbai sighed, bent down, picked up the little guy, and then the scroll was rolled up by Sudbai and placed on his body. This scroll, like the bronze box that I got, should not be something that I can control at my current level of strength. If I am not careful, it may backfire on me. Taking the little guy back to the bedroom, Sudbai put the little guy on the bed first and went to the bathroom in the bedroom to take a shower. When he came out, the little guy was playing with Sudbai's mobile phone. He didn't know how to play with it. Just watching Sudbai's phone keep shining. This was Sudbai's negligence. He turned on the TV and ordered an Ultraman program. The little guy likes to watch animations, and Ultraman is his favorite. When the Ultraman theme song played, the little guy immediately stared at the program seriously, his mouth wide open. When Sudbai saw this scene, he smiled knowingly, stretched out his hands to hold the little guy in his arms, and the little guy leaned on Sudbai's belly and continued to watch his TV. Sometimes, Sudbai envied him. He was satisfied with being fed and watching animated programs. It would be great if he could live such a simple life. Of course, this was just a momentary emotion, just like most adults. Whenever I see children playing, I feel sad for a moment. Smelling the milky scent of the little guy, Sudbai slowly closed his eyes and fell asleep holding the little guy in his arms. This sleep was not very long, but it was extremely comfortable. Every time he was with the little guy, Sudbai could always find his own inner peace. When he woke up, the little guy was lying on his belly, and he was still sleeping. He was snoring slightly, and it seemed that the little guy continued to stay up late watching countless episodes of Ultraman after he fell asleep yesterday. Sudbai gently removed the little guy from his body, stood up, changed his clothes, and went downstairs. Ji Xiang was lying at the entrance of the corridor. When he saw Sudbai coming, he just opened his eyes slightly and looked at it, then got up and went to the bedroom to take care of the little guy. Sudbai was going to make a simple breakfast in the morning. In fact, he had nothing to do today. However, to Sudbai's slight surprise, someone came to the door early in the morning. Through the surveillance monitor at home, he could see that the person who rang the doorbell was a young man wearing a red sportswear. The man wore a sports cap and looked very tough and sunny. However, Sudbai did not recognize this man. "Hello, Mr. Su, I have something to ask you." The other party's attitude was very good, and his voice was polite and humble. Sudbai opened the door. When the other party saw Sudbai standing in front of him, he immediately took off his hat and bowed slightly to Sudbai. Sudbai nodded, indicating that the other party could come in and sit down. A very nice house, the other party praised. What would you like to drink? Subai asked. Oh no, don't bother. I'll just say a few words and leave. The other party seemed a little cautious, putting his hands on his knees and sitting upright on the sofa. Subai brought him a can of Coke, and the other party took it with both hands politely. Tell me. Subai also opened a can of orange juice. We have an organization. The young man looked at Subai. We would like to invite you to join us. Oh? What organization? Subai gently rubbed his fingers on the table. There was no obvious energy fluctuation on the other party, so Subai didn't know whether the other party was the audience. An organization, an alliance that belongs to our audience. The young man looked at Subai and said this. Audience? Really? However, Subai couldn't understand why this piece of information about him was leaked. Horror broadcasts do a very poor job of protecting the privacy of listeners' data. How did you find me? Subai asked. We have information. I don't know how the information came from. I just passed the third experience mission, so now I am just an errand boy. By the way, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Xueming, from Zhejiang. Hangzhou native. Subai nodded. For some reason, Subai was disgusted with this kind of privacy leakage, especially since Subai didn't like to be a social butterfly with a name in various circles like a fat man. He was relatively low-key, or rather relatively low-key. Being solitary and not interacting too much with other listeners also gave Subai a sense of security. But now, this sense of security has been pierced again and again. My information have been revealed twice in a short period of time by two groups of people. Are there any benefits to joining this organization, or alliance? Subai asked, shaking the orange juice in his hand. This alliance is mostly composed of middle and low-level listeners. Of course, there are also a few relatively strong listeners. It has built a channel for mutual help within the alliance, such as the circulation and transaction of some props and magic weapons and the exchange of intelligence. As for the rest, yes, there are actually no other constraints. A non-binding alliance, Subai suddenly felt a little funny. In that case, what's the difference between joining and not joining? For most listeners, restrictions are unreasonable. Xueming was happy. The more freedom there is, the more suitable it is for the listeners. So, how do I count as joining? I'm just here to ask for your permission. We have an online forum where we can exchange and publish some information. In order to show sincerity, it is all done by the lowest level of the audience like me. Make the announcement. Xueming stood up and bowed to Subai. Okay, I'll join. This is the address of our forum and your account password. Please accept it. Xueming put a list on the coffee table, and then said, I won't disturb you anymore, I'll take my leave first. Walk slowly. Thanks. Xueming left Subai's home. Subai stood in front of the living room window and watched Xueming drive away. Picking up the card on the coffee table, Subai did not rush to log into the forum, but put it into his wallet. To be honest, Subai still had a few gadgets in his hand that he could sell, but the estimated price together they are not worth 150 story points. Whether Subai has the story point or not does not have much impact. But this alliance is indeed a very comprehensive platform. However, the binding force is more like Dobeo, but worse than Dobeo, because it does not actually have a decent regulatory agency, and since the account and password are given by the other party, those who truly control this alliance can naturally obtain the greatest convenience in information control from this channel. However, in the final analysis, it is still a mutually beneficial measure. Subai took out his cell phone. He remembered that the monk told him that he was coming to Shanghai for a meeting. When he was about to call the monk's message had actually been sent. It was just that Subai hadn't seen it before. Within half an hour, it was sent before, which means he will arrive at the airport at about 9 o'clock. The time was almost up. Subai drove directly to the airport. After sending 2 messages to the monk telling him the location of the parking lot, Subai put down the seat and lay in the car, listening to the song. It was almost halfway. An hour later, someone knocked on the car window and the monk arrived. Subai opened the car door and let the monk sit in, then drove the car out. "Monk, I haven't seen you for half a month. You look much haggard," Subai said. "It's a lot to worry about. Like attending this meeting." "Human beings always have concerns in the world," the monk said. "I deeply understand." The car drove to the traffic light, and suddenly, sirens suddenly sounded all around. Subai frowned slightly, then looked at today's calendar and felt relieved. Today is September 18th. The alarm bell is ringing, don't forget history. At this time, the monk suddenly pulled down the car window, bit his finger, and then smeared his own blood on the right reflector. Subai subconsciously looked at the right reflector and saw a row of soldiers wearing Japanese uniforms from there. They lined up from behind their car and walked over openly holding the sun flag. "Which idiot businessman is using this kind of hype today?" Subai cursed as he rolled down his car window and stretched his head out to look at the back of his car. Behind myself. There were only a few cars parked behind him waiting for the red light. Not a single pedestrian. "This is the Yin soldier's excuse," the monk said slowly. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 223. There are 3 types of so-called Yin soldiers borrowing the road. The first type of Yin soldiers borrowing means that after the ancient or modern army was defeated, it was caused by its lingering resentment and the weather and geographical environment at that time. The second type of Yin soldiers often appear after a great disaster has killed many people. This kind of Yin soldiers refer to the ghost generals who come to the underworld to capture the souls. The third type is the Ghost World War. The Japs shouldn't have appeared anyway. We lost a lot of people here during the Songhu War of Resistance. If they should show up, it should be our troops or the people who were killed by the Japs. Subai didn't feel too scared. After all, with his experience here, he could maintain a calm attitude when encountering ghosts or other supernatural things, and even had the mood to joke about it. The war between the 2 countries, especially the war involving 2 huge nations such as China and Japan, is no longer a strangulation of hundreds of thousands of lives, but also a bite of the national destiny of the 2 countries. In this kind of under the crushing force of the country's general trend, the millions of undead souls who died in that war could only passively integrate into the general trend, turning into consumption and growth of the national destiny, so this is why so many people died during that period. The reason why few people can turn into ghosts. Is there still this way? Subai smiled. "I have learned a lot." Subai took out a cigarette, lit it, and continued to turn to look at the reflector. The Japanese team was still walking, and there were probably quite a lot of them. Then what happened to this group of Japanese soldiers? "This is different from what you said before, monk." "But this can only mean one thing." The monk looked at Subai with a smile. Subai was no stranger to the monk's smile, he was even very familiar with it. The monk was a very sinister and wealthy man. People who didn't know the monk well thought he was kind to this kind of smile, but Subai knew clearly that this was the monk had a calculated excitement in his heart. This means that this group of Japanese soldiers did not die in battle, but died of other reasons, and that reason can make them turn into ghosts after death, and can also form the ghost soldiers decades later. The monk put his hand on the car window. "Subai, this is the luck of the poor monk." Subai shook the cigarette ashes and said, "Come on, you are starting to become narcissistic too. I'll pull over and you can get out of the car and follow that team of underworld soldiers." "Why do you still want this car?" The monk was a little confused. Obviously, the monk knew about Subai's family background. When they were in Josegu, Subai paid for the expenses all the way. Now Subai actually paid so much attention to the pusa, which surprised the monk. "Because this car is clean," Subai said seriously. "Okay, "I'll get out of the car first." At this time, the red light hadn't passed yet, so the monk opened the car door and walked out, then walked around to the back of the car, probably chasing the Yin soldiers. Subai waited for more than 10 seconds, and the red light changed to green. He immediately turned left, and then stopped the car in front of the shop. He didn't care if the shop owner would scold him, so he got out of the car and walked directly through the red light and the sidewalk. Cross the road and come back. If nothing else, Subai was really worried that that wretched, trivial monk would deliberately leave him behind. Not only could the monk do this kind of thing, but he could also do it cunningly, and Subai couldn't see those things. Japanese soldiers, if they don't follow the monk, they are like headless flies. Fortunately, the route that the group of Yin soldiers walked was a bit strange. They were not walking in a straight line, even though there was a crowded square in front of them. They were walking in a curve, because Subai saw the monk kept walking in a curve in the square. It looked really good. It seems like a waste of effort. This is not difficult to understand. Perhaps in the eyes of those Japanese soldiers, what they saw was the layout of old Shanghai, not the layout of the current international metropolis. In that era, this place might have been alleys, so they were also walking around inside. Subai was no longer in a hurry and silently lit another cigarette. He had already estimated that the monk would come towards him. Sure enough, 2 minutes later, the monk came over and walked away from Subai without saying a word. Past. Subai followed the monk with a cigarette butt in his mouth. After crossing another street, Subai saw the gate of a middle school appearing in front of him. This middle school is old, and it is one of the best preserved old-fashioned buildings in Shanghai today, and it is still in use. Today is a weekend, so there are not many students in the school. Except for some students who come to make up classes, it seems quite deserted. Subai, check the information of this school, specifically the buildings in this school. The monk's eyes glowed with a faint blue light, which was more serious than glaucoma. Obviously, he did not dare to relax at all, and kept capturing it with all his might. The dynamics of the group of Japanese soldiers in front. Subai took out his mobile phone, entered the name of the school, and then entered Baidu Encyclopedia. However, Baidu Encyclopedia was relatively simple and had nothing constructive. Subai exited and entered the school's official website. The homepage is a large picture of a university leader visiting the school for inspection. Basically, these useless promotional materials and pictures fill most of the page. This is also what most school official websites in China look like. After searching and searching, Subai finally found a link entrance in a small corner of the homepage. It said Historical Accumulation of XXX Middle School. After clicking on it, Subai saw some old photos and a graphic article. The publication date of the pictures and text was actually 5 years ago. It was written by an old teacher and introduced the history of the school in detail. Subai looked around and caught the keyword during the anti-Japanese war. After scanning the content, Subai turned off the phone and patted the monk in front of him on the shoulder. This school really had connections with the Japanese in the past. After the Japanese occupied Shanghai, they converted it into a military hospital. Military hospital, the monk frowned. Do you have more specific information? No, even if you look up the history of this school, you can't find anything, because probably no one is really interested in the specific details of the purpose of this school being used as a military hospital by the Japanese. It's impossible for the Yin soldiers to take advantage of the passage without reason. Obviously, there are things in this school that can trigger these Yin soldiers, the monk said solemnly. By the way, monk, there is one thing I want to ask you. Can these Yin soldiers hurt anyone? It's impossible, or it's difficult. Yin soldiers are different from ghosts and ghosts. They are in another world, or another time and space. Moreover, they pay more attention to rules than ghosts. The monk had already entered the campus with Subai. The old man at the gate didn't care that Subai and the monk walked in. He just looked up and then continued to lower his head and read the newspaper in his hand. Where are they going? Subai looked around. At this time, he and the monk had passed through the main building of the teaching building and were already walking towards the playground. The monk led the way to the playground, then stopped and said, "They are lining up in the playground." Subai stretched out his feet and stepped on the playground. "What's down here?" 9 times out of 10 the monk said seriously. "Didn't they notice it when the school renovated the playground?" Subai knelt down and stretched out his hand to look at the fake turf and the surrounding plastic track. "Sure, I guess they didn't notice it. This playground project is quite watery." "You are studying this major?" "Haha," Subai smiled, "I will design a small house for you when I have the opportunity in the future." The monk thought about it seriously, and then replied seriously, "After the poor monk dies, the relics will definitely be burned and enshrined." "Well, the Yin soldiers are starting to prepare to go back." "Aren't we going to go back the way we came?" Subai asked. The monk shook his head, "No need. Where they come from and where they go are nothing. Only their destination is a truly valuable place." At this time, the monk also squatted down, then simply lay down, put his ear on the turf and listened. "Subai, can you buy this school?" the monk asked. After asking, the monk seemed to realize something was wrong. He didn't know that Subai was dividing and transferring his property. With Subai now with his wealth, it is now impossible to control this school. The problem that the monk thinks is that he does not want to wait too long, wait until all formal procedures are completed, and then start digging openly. "No, tonight, we come dig the playground." Haha, Subai laughed twice. "Shall we dig with a shovel?" "But, you can drive an excavator over. As long as we take care of the surrounding surveillance in advance, and then the poor monk will arrange a formation in the construction area, basically there won't be a big problem. I have less than 2 days to enter the story world." "Monk, do you want me to play with you on the excavator now?" "It won't take long." The monk looked at Subai and said, "This is an opportunity. If the poor monk guessed correctly, there should be a Japanese onmyoji magic weapon buried here. Aren't you tempted?" "The magic weapon is not of much use to me. If I get it, I still have to cash it in and give it away." Subai was about to leave with some lack of interest. The monk suddenly showed his solemn face and said seriously, "Subai, even if you are not motivated by profit, can't you be moved by the cries of the compatriots who were killed here decades ago? TCH, do you think I'm a hot-blooded angry young man who screams after being teased by you for a few words?" Subai continued to walk out of the playground without looking back. At this time, the monk recited a scripture. The Buddha's voice is mighty and sheds a radiance that is not noticed by others. Next moment, from every corner of the playground, from all directions, there was an extremely sad sound coming from wailing, screams, cry. Subai's footsteps also stopped. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 224. Subai looked around, and he saw many muddy hands on the ground, slapping the ground constantly. The scene was miserable, the picture was desolate, and an atmosphere of depression and sadness almost swept over him. But, this place was once a burial ground. The monk clasped his hands together and showed compassion on his face. It is estimated that hundreds of people were buried alive here, but this incident was submerged in the war years. After all, since this is a Japanese military hospital, it is difficult to spread what happened inside, and it is very private. Most Chinese people only remember the Nanjing massacre and several brutal Japanese massacres written in a few strokes in history textbooks. Subai, don't you want to find a result for their death? Subai turned his head and looked at the monk with a smile. They have died very pitifully. After so many years, you used Buddhism to force them to show themselves, in order to stimulate me to help you find the onmyoji magic weapon. Monk, can you be a little more bottom line in your life? Immediately afterwards, Subai turned around without hesitation and continued walking outside the playground. Subai didn't like the feeling of being threatened, whether it was inducement or moral pressure. Sometimes, moral pressure was even worse than inducement. The ground made Subai feel sick. These people have been dead for decades, and now they have returned to dust. What they have left here is nothing more than a little imprint of their souls from that period. Subai walked to the teaching building, and the monk was still standing on the playground. At this time, a school security guard passed by, saw Subai, and asked, "Who are you?" "Looking for someone," Subai replied calmly. "Oh," the security guard responded and left without saying anything else. Subai looked back and found that there was no longer a monk on the playground, and the playground had long since returned to calm. This area was usually used by the school for students to have physical education classes. I guess not many people could have expected that. Where hundreds of dead souls were buried alive decades ago. Silently, Subai sat down on the steps of the teaching building, took out a cigarette, didn't light it, just bit it in his mouth. This sitting lasted for half the afternoon. Because it was a weekend, no one came to disturb Subai. When it was almost evening, Subai slowly got up and left the school all the way to where he parked his car. The boss at the door of the store saw Subai. When Bai arrived, he immediately ran out of his shop with a broom, but Subai was faster. He rushed into his car and started it, stepped on the accelerator and rushed onto the road. In fact, the boss didn't remove the wheels of his car or deflate his tires on purpose, which is already considered a good temper. After all, he parked his car in a hurry and blocked the door of his store, which probably made him nervous all afternoon. Not very easy to do business with. Subai held the steering wheel with one hand, and fiddled with the radio unconsciously with the other hand. However, Subai was not very satisfied with these radio programs. He felt a little upset while listening to them, so he simply turned off the radio. At this time, Subai didn't want to go home and didn't know where to go. This time, he drove the car to a river and stopped, rolling down the window. The weather in Shanghai was not very good today, but after all, summer was already here. In the past, the summer heat was about to subside and cloudy days made people feel more comfortable. Subai sometimes feels lonely, but loneliness does not make him feel disgusted. On the contrary, in Subai's perception, loneliness can often bring him a great sense of security. The next story world will only come in 2 days. Subai doesn't know how to spend these 2 days. Compared with 2 days, practice and grinding seem to be a drop in the bucket. Subai is just a last-minute thing. Bai was unwilling to do it and too lazy to do it. Subai also felt that sometimes he was too casual and his patience was pitiful. He knew all these things, but he was too lazy to change them. Just like Subai also, it's like knowing that I have a mental illness, but I'm not very worried. People have to be free and have an outlet. Subai understood this and did so. The car was parked on the side of the road, with pedestrians passing by from time to time. When a young man walked past Subai's car, a playful smile suddenly appeared on Subai's face. This young man, whom I had just met, was Xueming, the errand boy who specially came to his home to invite me to join some organization. Xueming entered the flower garden directly and followed the path into a small cafe in front. Subai silently put down the armchair and lay down halfly. He was too lazy to ask what Xueming was doing in the cafe, and he was too lazy to wonder if the organization had any secrets. Now, Subai really hopes that he can directly enter the story world in the next moment, because he really doesn't miss many things in this real world. The little guy may be his biggest concern now. As for other people, he doesn't have much. There's so much you can care about. Living in this world is so boring, Subai sighed in his heart. At this time, he was wondering whether Li Ji and the others also felt this way, so they chose to leave because they were tired of this world. Subai couldn't help but smile a little. It seemed that although his strength was not comparable to Li Ji and others, his mentality was almost the same. At this moment, Subai saw Xueming stumbling out of the cafe covered in blood in the reflector. He seemed to be injured. When he ran to Subai's car, Xueming was unsteady on his feet. Xueming fell next to Subai's car, and slapped Subai's car window with two bloody hands. Then Xueming got up. He saw Subai, and his eyes were full of surprise. Obviously, he did not expect that in this I would meet Subai when I was young, but his face immediately showed a look of pleading, and he shouted silently. "Help me, help me." Subai looked at Xueming outside the car window. Behind Xueming, Subai did not see the person who was chasing him, but Xueming's expression and his current situation were obviously not fake. But even so, Subai was still very calm. Just like his previous mood, his lazy mentality did not calm down at all even when he saw Xueming and Subai covered in blood. It was like a deep pool with no waves in the ancient well, and a small splash appeared after a stone was thrown into it. There were ripples, but it soon calmed down again. Subai turned his head slightly and looked at Xueming. He didn't unlock the car door, so Xueming couldn't get in. Subai didn't say help or not, he just watched Xueming shouting quietly. "That's interesting, isn't it?" Suddenly, Subai felt that his eyes began to feel a little dry, and he felt sleepy. After closing his eyes for 7 seconds, Subai suddenly opened his eyes. His eyes were instantly filled with bloodshot eyes. "It's interesting. I'm watching the show next to you, and you actually want to drag me into the water. Are you really so confident?" Subai did not open the car door for Xueming, but opened his own door and got out of the car. When Xueming saw Subai coming over, he immediately breathed a sigh of relief, and then sat down against Subai's passenger door. His lips turned white and his breathing was weak. This was a sign of excessive blood loss. Subai ignored Xueming and just walked straight forward, facing the coffee shop. Sitting next to the glass window of the coffee house is a man wearing a white suit. Everything from his hairstyle to his leather shoes is very exquisite. It can even be described as perfect, a bit similar to the male protagonist in Guo Jingming's movie. The other person's spoon kept touching the coffee cup gently, but the originally inaudible sound seemed to penetrate the glass, penetrate the distance, and resound directly to the bottom of Subai's heart. Xueming still looked frightened, but when Subai stood in front of him, his expression became much calmer. The bloodshot eyes in Subai's eyes began to become more and more dense, proving that he was getting more and more sleepy now. The sound made by the spoon seemed to have a natural hypnotic ability, making it difficult to extricate himself. When the other party saw Subai, there was no unnecessary expression or even unnecessary words. He just turned his head lightly, looked at the cup of coffee in front of him, stretched out his hand, and made a gesture of invitation. "I mean, buy you a cup of coffee." "Certainly. The premise is that you can make it through." Subai already felt that his consciousness was falling into chaos, but he was still holding on. After eating that ball of human brain flour, Subai's mental power was obviously improved to a higher level, so he was resisting all kinds of obstacles. It also has some advantages when it comes to this kind of spiritual influence. After gritting his teeth and even biting the tip of his tongue, Subai yawned and put his hands on his waist. The other party seemed a little surprised, because he could feel what Subai was going to do, so he smiled slightly and put down the spoon. The feeling of sleepiness dissipated in an instant, and Subai's body swayed. The feeling of being drowsy just now but now full of energy was really unaccustomed to him, but he still let go of his hands and walked towards the cafe. Everyone in the cafe was asleep, both customers and waiters, all sound asleep, so the cafe was very quiet. Only Beethoven's piano music was playing, which added to the feeling of tranquility. "I just thought you were bored, so I kindly wanted you to take a nap, but you actually thought about pulling out your gun. This is so unfriendly." The other party looked at Subai and said. Subai came over and sat down opposite the other person. The coffee in front of him was not cold yet. Subai picked it up, took a sip, frowned slightly, put it down, and reached for the other person's coffee. The other party looked a little surprised and stretched out his hand to stop Subai, but Subai suddenly grabbed the other party's hand and clasped it on the table. The other party's delicate face finally showed a look of panic. Subai turned over the other person's cup of coffee, and coffee stains spilled out. At the same time, a black toad rolled out. "Didn't your mother tell you that if you don't have the strength, you shouldn't pretend to be cool?" You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 225. The black toad seemed to dislike being treated so roughly. It rolled over and opened its mouth at Subai, as if roaring, as if condemning the numerous crimes Subai had committed. However, it is just a toad after all. Even if it has powerful hypnotic ability, it still cannot change the fact that it is just a toad, so it looks a bit childish and ridiculous like this. Subai casually picked up a fork next to the snacks on the dining table. No. The other party wanted to stop him, but when he just shouted, he only heard an extremely clear clang. This black toad had been nailed to the table by Subai. The blood of the black toad is green. At this time, the green blood began to spread, bringing a foul smell. Subai took a deep breath. His expression was a bit intoxicated, but Subai still resisted the urge to stretch out his fingers to get some black toad blood to taste some, but silently crossed his hands and looked at it calmly. The man in front of him looked at him as calmly as the man before. However, the originally delicate man in front of him seemed a little too overwhelmed at this time. He began to panic, his eyes were filled with disbelief and a hint of panic. What surprised Subai slightly was that his fear was not about himself, but about something else. After a while, Subai came to his senses, stretched out his hand and gently touched the body of the black toad. To be honest, the feeling was very bad. "You're not its owner, are you?" The man nodded with great difficulty, and then scratched his hair with great emptiness. "I will die." The other party said that he himself would die, not that Subai would die. Subai was a little surprised and said, "Under the terrorist broadcast, no one can kill you casually." The man almost shed tears. He curled up on the chair and shook his head desperately. "No, he can. I made an oath to him. I am his servant and he is my master." Subai was silent. Horror broadcasts are very reasonable. This is something that all listeners know well. In fact, terror broadcasts are like kings in the Middle Ages in Western Europe, carrying great authority, and all listeners are equivalent to knights under the king. They have great freedom, but they must also be restrained by the king, and terrorist broadcasting has more supreme authority than any king in any period. If this man is really sworn to be the servant of another listener, his master wants to kill him, even if he is a listener. According to the horror broadcast's own interpretation of the rules and regulations, the horror broadcast will not pay attention to this. There is no cause and effect for one thing. When Subai was in London, Sophia's boss once asked Sophia to drink a glass of red wine. The red wine was full of blood worms. It might be an act, but Subai didn't think it was all a show. Sophia didn't say it, and neither did Subai. Asked, but Subai believed that the relationship between Sophia and her boss was not as good as it seemed. "Then there's nothing I can do to help." Subai smiled slightly and stood up immediately. Xueming didn't know why he came to this cafe, or why he had a conflict with the man in front of him. Subai didn't want to pay attention to these. Subai's curiosity was not that serious, but similarly, Subai killed the black toad. Subai didn't feel that he had done anything wrong. He was just sitting in the car at that time and did not rescue Xueming. He just watched everything with a cold eye, like an audience watching a play, and it was the other party who took the initiative to provoke him. The effect of hypnosis has spread to himself, so he can take revenge and kill the black toad, which is understandable and makes sense in terms of cause and effect. Even if Subai killed him, it would barely make sense, but it would definitely be tainted with cause and effect, because the other party didn't obviously show or make any move to kill him, so killing him would be a bit famous. What is not right is not fair. Before entering the next story world, Subai was unwilling to make it more difficult for himself in the next story world. However, this person seemed a little abnormal. For one listener to swear to be the servant of another listener, Subai seemed to be the biggest abnormality. From Subai's perspective, whether it is himself, Fatty, a monk, or Gyatso, they may have different personalities or behave differently, but without exception, they all have something in their hearts. Be proud of yourself. Becoming a listener and getting close to this terrifying broadcast is actually a kind of disaster and a curse. However, it is this disaster and curse that gives them qualifications and abilities that are different from all other living beings. No, you can't leave, you killed it, not me, not me. The man suddenly rushed towards Subai like crazy. Subai stopped. He did not draw his gun, because facing a person like this, Subai was not willing to waste his bullets. Although in many cases, Subai wasted his bullets seriously and casually. But sometimes, he also cherishes it extremely. Sneaking in the shadows. Subai's figure turned into black mist in an instant. The man passed through Subai's body and accidentally hit the chair and fell to the ground. Subai recovered his figure, slowly stepped forward, and stepped on the man's face with one foot. Are you worthy of being an audience? Oh, is it an honor to be an audience? A woman's voice came from behind Subai. Subai shrugged, then pushed down with his feet. The man's face was dented by Subai's step, and blood splattered everywhere. Say sorry. Subai raised his feet, and his boots were covered with filth. You don't have to say sorry. If you don't kill him, I will kill him and take my toad out to show off. I only let him be responsible for raising it, and I didn't allow him to take it out to show his prestige. The woman was wearing a very ordinary skirt and smelled faintly of oil smoke. She looked like she was preparing dinner for her husband and children in the kitchen at home before coming here. Subai shook his head, stepped on his boots on the chair, reached out and took out 2 tissues, and wiped his boots carefully. I mean, you have to say sorry to me, Subai said with a faint smile. You didn't take good care of your own dog, and it soiled my car and my shoes. You are very interesting, the woman replied. Her appearance was very ordinary, with obvious signs of age erosion. She should have worked hard for her family for many years, but she should not be more than 40 years old. She should be a traditional woman, but do you think talking to me like this will make you look powerful and cold, or will it reflect your own style? Subai threw the dirty paper towel on the ground, looked at his boots, and after confirming that there was no dirt, he took his feet back. I'm not a teenager, so I don't need to attract attention in this way. But unfortunately, you caught my attention. The woman's voice began to become stronger. So what? Subai asked back. Only your husband has tried your awesomeness, and I don't know. Besides, even if I know, what can you do to me? The woman stood there, seemingly suppressing her anger. Subai laughed instead. Are you hesitating now? Should you teach me a lesson at the cost of karma, or even, kill me? You know too. Of course I know. Don't you all have this kind of virtue? Don't all people have this kind of virtue? Subai patted his pants indifferently. You hesitate slowly, my child. He's also waiting for me at home. After saying that, Subai opened the door of the cafe and walked out. When he returned to his car, Subai saw that Xueming had fainted beside his car, still breathing. Subai thought for a while, but ignored him. He just got into his car first, then took out his mobile phone and called 120, saying that there was a car accident here. Then he looked at the cafe and saw that the woman was still standing there. In the cafe, everyone was asleep. After waving his hands and making a bye gesture, Subai started his car. After driving to his own community, Subai stopped the car in the open space in front of his villa. He did not rush to get out of the car and go home, but continued to sit in the car, holding the steering wheel tightly with both hands. If someone is sitting next to Subai at this time, he can clearly see that Subai's hands are shaking slightly and his lips are also slightly blue. Yes. This is because of fear. A deep fear. If that woman had taken action against him, she would not hesitate to be tainted by the cause and effect of doing so. Own. Can you still come back alive? Subai pulled the car's reflector to an angle so that he could see himself in the mirror. At this time, his face looked a little solemn. The problem of mental illness is changing, and it is no longer even a problem. That kind of personality, that kind of emotion, that kind of violence, that kind of style and habit of doing things without leaving any face or room. It has gradually become a normal state for Subai. Subai took a deep breath. He opened the car door and got out. The distance between the villas is very far, so it is different from other places in the city. It is very quiet here. Subai squatted on the ground silently, holding his face with one hand. But soon, he laughed again, a little wantonly and a little embarrassed. Click, the door of the house was opened. Jixiang was very dissatisfied and helped the little guy open the door. The little guy lay beside the door, watching Subai coming home, and clapped his little fleshy hands excitedly. Subai looked at the little guy and stopped laughing. Immediately, unknown tears began to fill his eyes. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 226. When he woke up in the morning, it was another peaceful and comfortable day. For Subai, a peaceful and normal life seemed a bit boring. He felt like he was about to get rusty. This was not the life he liked, nor was it what he was used to now. Life. Fortunately, tonight is the time to enter the story world, which can be considered a blessing in misfortune. Unknowingly, Subai had gone from fearing and worrying about entering a story world at the beginning to eager for its coming and even anxious because of its delay. The little guy woke up at this time. He leaned on Subai's shoulder and covered his eyes with his little hands. He moved away for a while, looked at Subai and smiled, and then covered his eyes and snickered to himself. That's how he is, no matter what. I can have fun all the time. After picking up the little guy and turning on the TV, Subai took out some snacks and drinks from the bedside table. An adult and a child didn't even brush their teeth, so they just sat on the bed eating snacks and watching TV. Well, to a certain extent, Subai did not look like a strict father. He just doted on the little guy from the bottom of his heart. Until noon, Jixiang came twice. Each time, he barked outside the door and scratched the door. Then he opened the door and came in to take a look. He found that Subai and the little guy were having fun on the bed, so his mood waned. The ground left, but Subai felt that Jixiang knew that he was about to enter the story world, so for the first time today, he did not have any dissatisfaction with him and the little guy being tired of being together. When it was almost 1 o'clock, Subai carried the little guy downstairs with him. They went into the bathroom together and put the little guy in the bathtub first. Subai quickly sat in it himself. The water began to slowly fill the bathtub, and there were 2 bathtub ducks swimming in front of the little guy. Subai gave the little guy some shower gel, then rinsed him clean, and then placed the little guy on the edge of the bathtub. The little guy's 2 little fleshy legs shook, causing some water droplets to splash on Subai's body. Subai pretended to be angry and pinched the little guy's small breasts with both hands. The little guy was ticklish and immediately hugged her with both arms. Smiling to himself. After taking a bath towel, he dried the little guy and put on his clothes. Subai then wiped himself, put on a pair of loose pants, and carried the little guy out to the living room. Jixiang didn't go to see the picture today, but lay on the blanket in the living room. When he saw Subai taking the little guy out, he immediately got up and went to take care of the little guy. Subai changed into casual clothes and walked into the kitchen. The nanny would regularly replace the refrigerator with fresh food, although Subai rarely cooked at home. Taking out some lotus root and egg flour from the refrigerator, Subai started to work. Soon, a burst of fragrance came from the kitchen. The little guy kept looking into the kitchen, obviously impatient. A large bowl of lotus root clips and 2 light side dishes were brought up by Subai. Then Subai went to make a simple seaweed and egg soup without cooking the rice. The little guy was holding lotus root clips in one hand and eating happily. Subai also sat next to him and ate with him. To be honest, Subai was not very hungry. To be precise, his hunger came from the spiritual level. The meal was simple but heartwarming. Subai wiped the little guy's oily mouth and hands with a wet wipe, then stood up and returned to the kitchen with the dinner plate. Jixiang helped the little guy bring out Ultraman, and the little guy, who had eaten and drank enough, began to concentrate on watching TV. At this time, Jixiang turned his head and looked at Subai, who was standing in the kitchen but looking the same way. There was only a glass door separating the kitchen and the living room, so it did not block the view. Subai made a gesture to Jixiang and pointed at the little guy, meaning to ask Jixiang to take good care of the little guy. Jixiang glanced at Subai with disdain, then knelt down next to the little guy solemnly, and watched TV with the little guy. Taking a deep breath, Subai opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of ice-cold orange juice, opened the lid and took 2 big sips. Just when he was satisfied, Subai noticed that the environment around him had changed. Not surprised. No panic. On the contrary, there is just a kind of emotion called wish fulfillment. Finally come. My story world. The orange juice in his hand was still there, and it was still a little cold. Subai did not waste it, but continued to sip it as he walked. Unknown, he thought that Subai was here for an outing instead of entering a story world where he could die at any time. Now, Subai is located in a city. Yes, it is not a mountain village or a deserted land, it is a city, a dark city. Since the last 3-month hiatus in horror broadcasting, the behavior and the way the story world was created have become more extreme and suspenseful. In Subai's opinion, it seems to be a bit overkill. However, Subai likes the current situation very much. This feeling. The main mission was not released at the beginning. This has happened many times. This requires the audience to trigger the main mission themselves. As Subai walked, the surrounding street lights were very dim, with a sense of depression that was difficult to describe in words. There was not a single person on the road, and judging from the style of the street lights and the buildings around the road, in this era, it is similar to what China looked like in the 1990s. Is it another story world adapted from a previous mystery? Subai thought in his heart. Meow. A cat meowed from the wall beside Subai, and a black cat suddenly jumped out. Subai subconsciously regarded it as auspicious, but then he was relieved. Although it was also a black cat, there was no comparison between this black cat and auspicious. In the eyes of this black cat, Subai could see that a kind of cunning that belongs to a wild cat, and Jixiang has a kind of cold and full of human thinking. The black cat was circling around Subai, its eyes kept wandering on Subai. Subai had no special reaction to this. The story world had begun. Everything here now either meant clues to him. Either it means a crisis. Subai is very eager for the story world because he longs for the taste of blood and the struggle to escape death in the story world. It is not that Subai wants to seek death in the story world. If you're dead, how can you still play? How to experience it? Meow. The black cat meowed again, but this time the meow seemed a little urgent. Sudbai's pupils shrank subconsciously, and then his whole body quickly tilted sideways. A cold and sharp breath passed by Sudbai's side, and a black figure appeared behind Sudbai. The street lights on the road were extinguished in a cooperative manner, and the place suddenly fell into darkness, leaving only a black cat's pupils emitting a faint green light. Sudbai's breathing began to become more and more gentle, and the secretion of adrenaline was constantly accelerating. At this time, he did not have the slightest panic about being attacked, but only the pleasure of a cheetah being stimulated to its excitement level again. The darkness was not only aimed at Sudbai, but also at that person. Obviously, it was very difficult for that person in the darkness, especially when Sudbai was motionless and even his breathing slowed down, and the other person could not be sure about Sudbai. Where is the position of white? Sudbai slowly clenched his hands, revealing two fangs at the corners of his mouth. He switched to vampire mode. At this time, he was a veritable ghost in the night. Hiss. A crisp sound suddenly came out, with a harsh sound of tearing flesh and blood. Sudbai suddenly pulled out his two Hellfire shotguns and pointed them there, but still did not fire. The surrounding temperature began to drop at this time, and there was even a faint frost on the roadside, which was enough to show the exaggerated temperature change. The pupils of the black cat began to sway continuously, like two ghosts in the darkness, elusive and impossible to figure out, but when the two eyeballs actually started to appear at the height of Sudbai's head, when it started to float, no matter how stupid Sudbai was, he knew that this cat was no longer the same cat as before. The Hellfire shotgun pulled the trigger suddenly, but nothing sprayed out from the muzzle, because Sudbai's hands were frozen in an instant and he lost consciousness. The two guns were still in his hands, but couldn't pull the trigger. Ah! A shrill scream came from about 7 or 8 meters behind Sudbai. It was the voice of a man. The voice was high-pitched at first and then immediately fell into a trough. This sound was very familiar to Sudbai. It was the last whimper that a person makes when he suffers a fatal blow before death. A person died next to him. Sudbai subconsciously licked his lips, and the tip of his tongue could already smell the taste of blood. Nervous. Stimulate. How wonderful. Sudbai let out a low roar in his throat, and his body quickly switched from vampire state to zombie state. The stiffness in his arms dissipated in an instant, and the freezing feeling disappeared. After all, for zombies, wanting to be frozen, it's a bit difficult for him. A dirty, evil, and gloomy atmosphere began to spread from Sudbai's body, and a strong evil spirit began to rise noisily. At this moment, the street lights that had just been extinguished slowly turned on again, and visibility returned to the surrounding area. About 7 or 8 meters next to Sudbai, a man's body was lying there, and the black cat had disappeared. Sudbai walked over. The man's death was very miserable. He was still holding a dagger in his hand. There were runes on the dagger. Judging from his clothes, he should not belong to this era, which means that this dead man should be the audience. This time, I was transported to an ongoing story world halfway. Sudbai suddenly thought of the fat man and the Westerners last time. They also entered the story world of Mr. Zombie from the middle. See, come on, it will be the same this time. Most of the man's face was eaten away, and his heart disappeared from his chest, leaving only a horrific bloody hole. In the man's other hand, he held a leaflet. Sudbai squatted down and took out the leaflet. This was a leaflet given to students by the school. Dear classmates and parents, hello. The school hereby solemnly refutes the rumors that the cat-faced old lady in Harbin spread in the society is pure nonsense. Parents are asked to educate their children well and prevent feudal superstitions from poisoning the future flowers of our motherland.